My name is Carmen Reyes. I am 40 years old. I spent nearly 2 decades working in a place where my name didn't exist, and my face was never meant to be remembered. Officially, I no longer serve. Unofficially, I never stopped. I was once a field strategist for one of the most classified intelligence units under the Department of Defense. And yet last week I sat at my sister's promotion ceremony. Uninvited. When her base commander walked in, he glanced across the room, locked eyes with me, and whispered, "Wait, you're General Reyes." The room froze. Even my father, who hadn't said my name out loud in 17 years, couldn't speak. They all thought I failed. They told everyone I quit. And somewhere along the way, someone made sure my name was stamped deceased 2009. Signed, Melanie Reyes, my little sister. It started the way these things usually do. Routine. Just another day reviewing quarterly coordination reports for the Strategic Advisory Group. I wasn't supposed to be on site that week. I had swapped shifts to cover for a retired major who broke his hip. That simple small act of kindness, one email, put me in the right room at the wrong time. There was a file open on the shared drive, a flagged list of attendees for an upcoming ethics panel at Fort Bragg. The type of thing I usually glance at once, then move on. But I recognized a name, Melanie Reyes, my sister. She was scheduled to deliver closing remarks on the moral authority of military judges. It didn't surprise me. Melanie always knew how to speak where it mattered. The kind of voice people listen to before they know whether they should. But what did surprise me was the line beneath her name, a section titled Family Acknowledgement. There it was in memory of Captain Carmen Reyes, KIA, March 2009. At first I thought it was a typo. I checked the document properties. It had been edited 3 days ago by an account registered to Melanie's division. I stood there for a while, longer than I should have. I reread the sentence, and again, and again. The only part of me that moved was my hand slowly reaching for the mouse. I clicked into the personnel archive, the digital version of our lives, neatly categorized, endlessly expandable. I found my own record, except it wasn't mine anymore. The access date showed no login activity from me in over a decade. But there was a digital note at the bottom, status revised for security alignment. Deceased record maintained to protect classified asset identities. Except I never approved that. No one ever asked. My name was still in the system, but not as a person. As a cautionary tale, a ghost file. The more I dug, the worse it got. Someone had linked my death record to a redacted incident in Kandahar, one I was never assigned to. The entire trail looked legitimate. Except I had been in Stuttgart when that mission occurred. That night I couldn't sleep. I laid in bed in a room where every corner hummed with silence and stared at the ceiling like it might blink first. By morning I made one decision. I wouldn't call, I wouldn't write. I would walk through that courtroom myself, not to confront, not to punish, but to let them all see the one thing they never expected to see again. The woman they had written off as gone, alive, unforgiven, and finally, undeniable. I hadn't logged into the legacy system in over a decade. It wasn't part of my current clearance flow, but I still remembered the access path. The dead never really forget how they were buried. The interface hadn't changed much. Gray tabs, clunky menus, that dull hum only old systems carry like they know they're storing ghosts. I bypassed the public military index and opened the archival status logs. Casualty database, restricted tier. I typed my last name, then my first, and hit search. 3 results loaded. 2 were soldiers I'd trained with years ago, both fallen in Iraq. The third Reyes Cadet 09, classified removal. I clicked. There was no photo, just a redacted image. A black bar sliced horizontally across where the eyes would be, like I wasn't just gone, but deliberately erased. Below it, cause of death, undisclosed. Clearance tier redacted. Recommendation, do not flag. Every time I reopened the file, the same system glitch flashed in the top right corner, asset memorialized. Legacy protection in effect. Not decommissioned, not retired, memorialized. Like a statue no one was ever allowed to visit. I scrolled to the bottom, there in small gray text record, finalized by Lieutenant M. Reyes, March 2009. It wasn't just a clerical error. It wasn't even just a betrayal. She had made my absence official, permanent, documented. I leaned back in my chair, my breath refusing to stay even. For 18 years, I told myself the silence was protocol, that the isolation, the disconnection from my family, was necessity, that maybe one day when the work was over, I'd explain it all, and maybe they'd understand. But that file didn't look like something done by someone waiting for an explanation. It looked like a final word, signed with the kind of confidence only someone with no intention of asking questions could write. I tried to recall where I was in March 2009. I remembered the desert. I remembered burning sky. I remembered losing contact with HQ for 72 hours. I remembered walking out of a safe house barefoot because I'd traded my boots to stop a local from alerting the wrong people. But I didn't remember dying. And yet there it was. Official, filed, endorsed. In her world, her version of the truth, I had ceased to exist. I didn't just leave the room. I had been written off as fallen. And that changed everything. Because if I could be dead on paper, then showing up in person wouldn't just be awkward. It would be war. I turned off the screen. The silence afterward felt surgical, not empty, but sharp. The kind that cuts inward. It was close to midnight. The base's overhead lighting system had dimmed by half. An old energy-saving policy still in effect from the war years. I didn't want to sleep. So I walked into the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror greeted me with something I hadn't seen clearly in years. Not the face of a strategist, not an officer, just a woman, mid-30s edging into 40. Eyes still steady, but they didn't shine the way they used to. My jawline was firmer than I remembered. The crease between my brows had deepened, not from age but from too many missions that didn't make the final reports. I stared at myself for a while. It's strange how long you can go without actually looking. When I was younger, I used to rehearse speeches in front of this kind of mirror. Promotion interviews, operation briefings, reassignment requests. I had always practiced making my words look calm. But now, there was no audience, no commanding officer to impress, no mission to justify, only me. I reached up and touched the edge of the mirror. My hand left a faint print smudged just enough to look like a question mark. Does anyone remember me? I didn't mean to say it out loud, but I did. The sound of my own voice startled me. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't broken, just unclaimed. There's a particular kind of invisibility that doesn't come from hiding. It comes from being slowly, systematically overwritten by people who rewrite the story because it's easier than asking why you left. I looked down at the sink. There was a crack in the porcelain, hairline almost invisible unless you knew to look. I used to be like that too. A fine fracture in an otherwise solid frame. You don't notice what's broken until the water starts to leak. I took a deep breath. Not to calm myself, but to prove I could still fill my lungs, because the woman in the mirror, she wasn't broken. She had just been shelved. For convenience, for image, for someone else's narrative. I wiped the mirror clean with my towel. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to hide the lines on my face. They were the only proof that I had lived beyond what the system remembered. The envelope didn't have a return address. Just the formal seal of the Office of Military Justice. Thick paper, embossed edges. The kind of mailing you either dread or ignore. I almost left it on the counter with the rest of the week's unopened notices. But something about the weight made me stop. It felt heavier than it should have. I opened it standing up. Inside was a folded letter, center-aligned, crisp, and bureaucratic in tone. You are formally invited to attend the 4th Annual Public Ethics Review at Fort Bragg. Panelists include legal scholars and high-ranking officers in the field of military justice. Among them, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Reyes, delivering the keynote on honor, memory, and moral discretion in modern warfare. I let the paper fall to the table. Of course, Melanie. She had always been good at titles, knew how to turn values into PowerPoint slides, how to turn someone else's silence into her own storyline. I didn't plan to attend, not at first, but I picked the letter back up and read the final section, a note of acknowledgement at the bottom. This year's panel is dedicated in memory of Captain Carmen Reyes, who served with distinction and gave her life in 2009. Her legacy continues to inspire integrity in uniform. I reread the words, not because I was shocked, but because of how confidently it was written. No hesitation, no footnote. They hadn't just listed me among the fallen. They'd offered a eulogy. I was now an example of sacrifice, a memory, a sentence dressed up as a tribute. And there it was again, my name, next to a year I didn't die under a title I never resigned, wrapped inside a version of me they found easier to respect once I was no longer around to contradict it. I looked over at the corner of my desk. My old military credentials sat in a plain folder untouched since the last security audit. No one outside my unit had seen them in 15 years. No one had asked. I wondered if I walked into that courtroom, would anyone recognize me, not by face, but by presence? Would they feel something shift? I folded the letter back up, slid it into its envelope, and placed it carefully next to my keys. The next morning, I filed for temporary clearance transfer. Then I booked a one-way ticket to North Carolina. I didn't pack a speech or a grudge, just a name, one I'd been forced to bury for almost 2 decades. And now I was ready to bring it back to life, on my terms. I hadn't touched the green canvas trunk in 18 years. It sat beneath the bed in the corner unit of my apartment. Dust settled like a soft refusal to be disturbed. When I pulled it out, the metal clasps resisted me, stiff from time or maybe from memory. Inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. One pair of polished boot soles, still caked with a trace of desert clay I never managed to clean. A compass with a cracked lens. A set of laminated maps in Arabic and Farsi folded so many times the edges had frayed. And then beneath them all, my uniform. Folded with care, crisp, precise, as if still waiting for inspection. I lifted it out with both hands. The jacket carried a faint scent, old starch sun and something metallic. I laid it on the bed and smoothed the front with my fingers. The name tape was still there. Reyes. I placed my palm flat against the left side of the chest, where a bronze star once rested. It wasn't there now. None of the medals were. Those had been packed away in a separate case, locked, archived, forgotten. But I could still feel the weight where they used to hang, like phantom limbs of the past. This wasn't the uniform I wore in the field. It was the formal set, the kind reserved for ceremonies I never attended, promotions I declined, burials I couldn't speak at. Back then I used to wonder what it would feel like to wear it in a room full of people who knew. Now I knew the answer. It would feel like a challenge. I folded the uniform again, slower this time, not out of reverence, out of deliberation, out of the knowledge that when I unpacked it again, it would be for no one's approval but my own. Next I reached for the smaller pouch tucked into the side compartment. Inside was a pair of dog tags, scratched, bent at one corner. I held them up to the light. There was a time I wore them like armor. Now they felt more like a signature. I zipped the suitcase shut. No extras, no cosmetics, no distractions. Just the uniform, the tags, a notepad, and the version of me they tried to bury in classified files and folded flags. I didn't plan to wear the uniform at the ceremony. I didn't plan to speak. But I wanted it near me, not as a symbol, not as proof, but as a reminder that the truth doesn't need permission to exist. And neither did I. I left before sunrise. I didn't tell anyone at the base I was going. Didn't tell the agency I was activating old credentials. Didn't tell myself what I expected to find. The interstate stretched long and flat, bordered by fields that had forgotten the sound of boots. I hadn't driven this route since 2006. Back then I was headed the other direction, away from Lexington, away from ceremony, away from the people who only knew how to speak in accomplishments. This time I was driving back in silence. The morning air was cold enough to bite. Not quite winter, not quite spring. That stubborn, undecided weather Kentucky always carried in its lungs. The sun came up around mile marker 72. Orange light spilled across the dashboard like something trying to apologize. But I wasn't ready to accept anything yet. Every town I passed felt like a former version of myself. Each gas station a checkpoint. Each overpass a memory. And the streetlights, the ones that used to flicker when we drove home from church, they were all still there, still humming, still blinking like nothing had changed. But everything had. By the time I hit city limits, my fingers had tightened around the steering wheel. Muscle memory, anticipation, or maybe just a quiet dread I hadn't let myself name. Lexington hadn't grown much. Same billboards, same diner signs, even the same pothole outside the old library. I turned onto my family's street slowly. The tires crunched against gravel in that familiar, deliberate way. There it was. The Reyes house. 2-story brick white shutters flag out front, still impeccably hung, still ironed at the corners. The porch swing was gone. So was the hibiscus bush Mom used to water every morning before church. But the door was the same, dark green with a gold handle that always stuck in the winter. I sat there in the car for a full 5 minutes, engine running, heart holding. Then I turned off the ignition. There's something odd about returning to a place that didn't wait for you. It's not rejection, it's not even absence, it's indifference. This house had moved on, and I wasn't sure I was still allowed to step inside it. I reached for my bag but paused. Out the window across the street, Mrs. Flannery was watering her front lawn. She glanced up. Her face changed, paused. I saw the flicker in her expression. Recognition, then something she quickly buried with a polite smile. She raised a hand in a wave tentative. I waved back. Maybe she thought I was a ghost. Or maybe in her version of the story, I had never really left. I stepped out of the car, pulled the suitcase behind me, and walked toward the house. Every footstep sounded too loud. Every breath felt like it might shatter. Home, I thought. But I didn't believe it. Not yet. No one opened the door. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting, not knocking, just waiting. Like some part of me still believed they might know I was out here. That someone, maybe Mom, might feel it in her bones. But nothing moved. So I turned the handle. It wasn't locked. The smell hit me first. Lemon polish and faint mildew. Like time had tried to stay sterile, but couldn't quite fight the moisture of memory. The hallway creaked under my boots. Same floorboards, same scuff near the radiator from when Melanie and I used to chase each other in socks. But now my steps felt foreign, heavy, unfamiliar. My father was in the living room, reading or pretending to. He didn't look up immediately, just turned a page like he had all the time in the world. Then slowly he raised his eyes. He nodded. That was it. No hug, no surprise. Just a nod. Like I'd come home from a grocery run, not from the dead. I stood there still holding my bag. Then my mother appeared from the kitchen. She had a dish towel in one hand and something unreadable in her face. Our eyes met. Her mouth parted like maybe she was about to say my name. But then she blinked, turned, and wiped the counter instead. A smudge that didn't matter more than I did. But at least it was something she could clean. Melanie was already seated at the dining table. Her back was straight. Her hair pulled tight in that sharp way she always wore it in court. She looked at me, cool, polite, lawyerly. Not cold, but not warm either. Chilam gidao naive. The question came like a test. Casual enough to be harmless, but loaded enough to wound. I almost answered. Almost said I've been living in systems you don't even know exist. Almost said I've spent the last 18 years keeping people like you safe. Instead, I gave her the kind of smile people wear when they've stopped asking for permission to belong. Reading, I said. Mostly case files. She nodded as if that made sense. As if nothing was wrong. As if I'd never been erased by her signature. No one offered me a chair. No one asked if I was staying the night. No one poured water or wine or questions. I was back in the house, but not in the family. Not yet. Dinner was already set when I walked into the room. 8 chairs, polished silver. Napkins folded like small uniforms. Melanie had always been good at presentation. There were others there too, familiar but faded. 2 of my father's old colleagues, both now working in legal review panels. A retired logistics colonel, a young captain from Melanie's current unit, and a woman I didn't recognize, maybe a neighbor, maybe a new friend of my mother's. I stood at the edge of the table for a moment, unsure where to sit. No one moved to guide me. Melanie filled the silence effortlessly. "This is my sister Carmen," she said. She served briefly before switching tracks. She's in admin now, I think. No rank, no record. Just a vague afterthought packaged neatly enough to dismiss. I didn't flinch, didn't correct her, just smiled. That same small smile I'd used in briefings when politicians made assumptions I wasn't cleared to contradict. No one asked a follow-up question. A fork clinked against a glass. Someone chuckled politely. And then I saw him, Colonel Howard Blake. He had been at Fort Stewart the same year I'd written the tactical response manual for the Eastern Corridor. We had never met in person, but I recognized his file photo. His eyes were already on me. And the moment Melanie said the word admin, he paused. Very slightly, just enough. Then he placed his knife gently down on his plate. Not dramatic, not accusatory, but deliberate. Like a man who had just seen someone he wasn't supposed to. Our eyes met. And in that flicker of contact, silent, brief, I knew he remembered something. Maybe a report, maybe a name redacted but not forgotten. He said nothing, neither did I. Melanie turned back to her wine. My father was focused on the roast. My mother passed the bread without looking up. No one asked what I'd done all those years. No one asked where I had been. But that was the point, wasn't it? If you don't ask, you don't have to reconcile the answer with the version of the story you've already told. For the rest of the meal, I played the part they had written for me, nodded when someone referenced headlines I had ghost-written, laughed lightly at jokes about soft duty posts, sipped water when they toasted to Melanie's accomplishments. And when it was time for dessert, I excused myself quietly. I wasn't angry, not then. What I felt was something colder, more specific. They hadn't just erased me, they had rehearsed it. After the dishes were cleared and the wine glasses half emptied, I slipped away from the table. No one noticed. Or maybe they did, and chose not to follow. The hallway to the den was dim, lit only by the soft yellow sconce near the stairs. I didn't need light to find the photo wall. I remembered exactly where it was, just past the coat closet across from the old record shelf. It had grown since I last saw it. Dozens of frames lined the wall, spaced with surgical precision. Melanie in uniform at her officer school graduation. Melanie pinning medals on another officer. Melanie shaking hands with a general I once briefed behind mirrored glass. There were some older ones too. My parents on their 25th anniversary, my father's retirement dinner, a Christmas photo I'd never been in. And then a small frame, silver, a little off-center. I stepped closer. It was from the summer of 2003, 4th of July. We'd had a barbecue out back. I remembered the tank top I wore the way the sun burned my shoulders. I remembered Melanie laughing with sparklers. I remembered being there. But in this photo, I wasn't. Or rather, I had been. The edge of a shoulder remained, cut sharp as if someone had trimmed the photo to fit the frame. Or to fit the story. I reached up and touched the glass, right where my face should have been. The spot was cool beneath my fingers, empty. Like a silence you can see. It wasn't an oversight. It was too clean, too deliberate. They hadn't forgotten to include me. They had chosen not to. The photo, what was left of it, sat next to a printed plaque family. Duty, legacy, I almost laughed. But nothing came out. I heard a floorboard creak behind me, turned. It was my mother. She didn't say anything. Her eyes flicked from the photo to my hand, and then to the hallway behind us. I had to resize it, she said quietly, to make it fit. I nodded, but neither of us believed that was the reason. She stood there for another second, then turned and walked away. Her footsteps faded faster than I expected. I stood in front of the wall a little longer, not to search for another photo of me. I knew there wouldn't be one. Instead, I looked at the arrangement, the perfect spacing, the clean lines, the way everything fit so easily without me. They hadn't just moved on. They'd restructured the narrative to work better in my absence. And that was the moment I understood. It wasn't that I didn't belong anymore. It was that they'd made sure there was no space left for me to return to. The courtroom was colder than I remembered. High ceilings, fluorescent lights humming faintly overhead, polished wooden benches arranged in uniform rows. Everything about it was designed to command order and silence. I walked in quietly, no escort, no announcement. Took a seat in the last row, far corner, exactly where they wouldn't look. I didn't wear the uniform, just a black blazer and a soft gray blouse. Neutral, unremarkable, invisible by design. I wasn't there to interrupt. I was there to observe, to see the story she was ready to tell without me in the room. Except, this time, I was. Melanie stood at the podium spine, straight voice projected perfectly. Her rank insignia caught the light just enough to remind everyone she'd earned her place. She spoke about duty, about sacrifice, about the burden of judgment in the absence of perfect truth. Then she pivoted. To those who wear the uniform, she said there is a sacred trust, not just with the system, but with each other. A pause, calculated. She was good at those. And when that trust is broken, when someone walks away without explanation, it leaves more than a gap in the chain of command. It leaves a wound that must be cauterized. A few heads nodded. I didn't. She never looked my way, but she knew I was there. Every word was precise, every phrase carefully sharpened. She wasn't speaking to me, she was speaking over me. I leaned back in my seat, felt the wood press into my spine. No one around me flinched. To them, I was just another quiet observer. Someone's aunt, maybe. A distant relative they hadn't met. But to Melanie, I was the one shadow in a room she'd spent years trying to light from every angle. When she mentioned our family, it was brief. No names, just I come from a legacy of service. My father a military judge, my mother a combat analyst, my sister who once wore the uniform. Once. That word was heavier than the bench beneath me. I folded my hands in my lap, looked down at the faint line of my watch strap imprint, and waited. Not for her to finish, but for the moment she'd realize the room wasn't hers alone anymore. The doors opened without warning, no announcement, no shift in lighting, just the quiet creak of heavy wood and then footsteps, measured, deliberate, precise. I knew that cadence before I saw the man. General Farley. He didn't stride in like a superior. He entered like a storm front, silent, fully formed, and impossible to ignore. He walked halfway down the center aisle before stopping. Right there in the middle of the room, his eyes swept once across the benches, then locked on me. And I saw it. Recognition, not confusion, not doubt. Recognition followed by certainty, followed by respect. He squared his shoulders, raised his right hand, and offered a salute so crisp it cut the air. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the walls. "General Reyes, I didn't know you'd be here." The words hit harder than any accusation Melanie could have thrown. I didn't move, didn't blink. Around me the room hesitated. Whispers began. A shifting of posture, a rustling of programs. Up at the front, Melanie's hand twitched, just slightly, like she'd been struck in the chest. She turned her head, saw him, then saw me, and froze. The microphone crackled as her breath caught against it. General Farley didn't waver. He held the salute, not for ceremony, but for confirmation. I stood. I returned the salute, not out of pride, but out of honor, out of recognition, out of a silent promise once made in a desert base under fluorescent lights and classified orders. And just like that, the illusion cracked. The illusion that I was gone. The illusion that she was the only Reyes who mattered in that room. Farley stepped aside. Let the silence do what it was always meant to. Tell the truth. And the room listened. The silence after Farley's words didn't settle. It expanded, like a ripple that had forgotten how to stop. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, people began to rise. One by one, the entire courtroom stood. Not for Melanie, not for tradition, but for me. And not because of who I was on paper, but because of who they suddenly realized I had been all along. Melanie didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her body said enough. Stiff shoulders, tight jaw, eyes scanning the room for some place to hide, only to find none. At the bench, Judge Monroe looked up from her notes. She adjusted her glasses, paused, then spoke into the mic with a voice that cut cleanly across the space. "General Reyes has arrived. No ceremony, no applause, just confirmation. A title returned to its rightful owner." My father, seated 2 rows ahead, turned so fast his elbow knocked over his water glass. It hit the table with a sharp crack, a sound too close to a breaking point. He didn't pick it up. Didn't look at me either. My mother sat beside him, hands clasped so tightly in her lap, the knuckles had gone white. She didn't blink. No one offered me a seat near the front. I didn't need one. I stood where I was, grounded, uninvited, unshakable. Farley gave me the smallest nod before taking his place beside the other brass. He didn't need to say more. His presence had already rewritten the entire room. Melanie tried to continue. She cleared her throat. found her place on the note cards, spoke a sentence about military jurisprudence and personal accountability, but her voice cracked halfway through. One of the younger officers seated nearby leaned toward a colleague. "Is that her?" he whispered. From Operation Dagger I heard it. I wasn't supposed to, but I did. I felt every eye shift. Not toward Melanie, toward me. Or worse, toward the space between us. The gap between the story she'd told and the truth now standing in plain sight. She finished the speech, somehow. Polite applause followed. It was brief, thin, unconvincing. As the room began to move again, I stayed where I was. I didn't approach her, didn't demand anything. I had already taken back what mattered most. Visibility, in a family, in a courtroom, in a life. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not making noise. It's making silence impossible. The night air felt too still, as if the wind itself had paused to listen. I had just returned from the ceremony, still in uniform, the hum of the base's fluorescent lights echoing in my ears. I had hoped for quiet. But quiet never lasts long for ghosts who come back. At 22:43, someone knocked. Not a knock of courtesy. 3 sharp, deliberate strikes that made my ribs tighten. I opened the door to a junior officer I didn't recognize, young, rigid, trying to hide the tremble in his salute. "Ma'am, the base commander requests your presence." Immediate clearance granted. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. My car was still warm when I climbed back in. The roads of Fort Bragg were almost exactly as I remembered, lined with old oak trees and newly poured silence. But the gate this time wasn't ceremonial. It opened like a wound. Inside the ops room, a large monitor flickered with red. "Security breach," someone muttered. On screen was a file index I knew by heart. Project Candlestick. My last classified operation before my name was scrubbed from the system. But this wasn't old news. The file was time-stamped 15 minutes ago, and the leak hadn't come from outside. It had tunneled through our own servers. An internal breach that left a digital signature. An IP address familiar enough to punch a hole through my stomach, Fort Bragg. One line kept flashing at the bottom of the log. Reyes Deck 09. Classified removal. It shouldn't exist anymore. The junior tech officer turned toward me, hesitant. "We think it was triggered by someone reactivating your ID." I stared at the log again. Someone had tried to erase me in 2009, and now someone had brought me back to life. Not just in memory, but in code. I leaned closer. A name appeared in the access trail. Melanie Reyes, legal admin. My jaw locked. She didn't just bury me, she used my ghost to get access. And now she'd triggered something bigger than she could contain. The commanding officer entered the room. He nodded toward me. "General Reyes, we need to know. Should we treat this as sabotage or family business?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because the difference had just collapsed. Family was the sabotage. I looked at the screen one last time. Then I said with more steel than breath, "Secure every record. No one moves until we know what else she's touched." Outside, the wind picked up again. I wasn't just back. I was awake. And this time, I wasn't going to disappear quietly. They let me access the audit logs alone. Maybe it was out of respect. Or maybe no one else wanted to be in the room when I pulled the thread that could unravel everything. The console room was cold. The hum of servers filled the silence. I sat down, logged in with my reinstated credentials, and began tracing the breach. Each action leaves a mark, digital breadcrumbs that most people never think twice about. But I had spent years tracking hostile cyber networks. This wasn't new terrain. The file reactivation had come from a secure account. At first glance, it looked clean. No obvious malware, no external manipulation. But then I noticed a line in the metadata access point, personal device. Legal admin. I ran the device ID. It belonged to Melanie. 3 days before the leak, her device accessed an old restricted archive, one tied to decommissioned personnel records. At 03:17 in the morning, logged in for 42 minutes, and here was the strange part: the session had remained open. That meant one of two things. Either she forgot to log out, or she didn't know she'd ever logged in. I pulled the session trace. The access pattern didn't look accidental, it was methodical. Someone moving through files as if they knew what they were looking for but didn't want to be seen. Every time she opened a record, the system auto-generated a silent copy. And one of those copies triggered the reactivation of my old identity tag. a ghost returning from the wrong corridor. The system had responded as if I'd returned from the dead. Because technically, I had. I clicked into the activity log. At the bottom was the command line execution. Reyes Deck 09, status null, active. My death had been undone by her own hand. Whether she knew it or not, the room felt colder than it should. I exhaled slow, steady. Then I searched for the signature file that had executed the override. And there it was, a macro file. Labeled Ethics Testimony Draft Work 1, she was preparing her speech. And somehow reanimated me. Except, macros don't write themselves. I opened the file, scrolled to the footer. Last modified by Melanie. Reyes timestamp 03:41 a.m. I sat back. She hadn't just lied about me, she had tried to erase me, and now, by mistake or design, she'd summoned me back. A ghost she no longer controlled. Outside the server room, the hallway lights flickered. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. I saved a copy to a secure drive, ejected it, and slipped it into my pocket. If this was a war, it had just turned kinetic. And this time I was writing the report. I didn't confront her at home. Not yet. I waited until we were alone in the courthouse library, a quiet place full of blind corners and old legal texts no one read anymore. She was reviewing her notes, her tablet open on a table that once held depositions and confessions. I stepped in, closed the door behind me, and didn't bother to sit. "Melanie," I said, voice even. "Do you know what kind of system can auto-pull legacy macros from a retired personnel file?" She didn't look up right away, just tapped her pen lightly on the glass. 1 beat, 2. Then she slowly raised her head. "I don't know what you're talking about," but her voice was thinner than usual, like someone had turned the volume down. I walked over, placed a single flash drive on the table, the same one I'd pulled from the console room. Her eyes dropped to it. "Locked. Your device accessed a classified archive 3 nights ago. At 3:17 a.m., you stayed logged in for 42 minutes. She opened her mouth, closed it. I continued. "You created a file, named it Ethics Testimony, Hats Draft 01. Inside, it was a macro call. That macro reactivated a deleted identity record. Silence. I stepped closer. You know whose identity that was?" Her fingers curled slightly. "Mine." She finally looked me in the eye, and I saw it, just for a second. Not fear, not guilt, but something worse. Recognition. She knew exactly what she'd done, whether consciously or not. "I didn't mean," she started. "You didn't mean to bring me back," I asked. "Or you didn't mean to get caught?" Her jaw tightened. "That system logs everything. You know that. Which is why I'm standing here." I picked up the drive, slipped it back into my coat. "You're going to testify tomorrow. You're going to speak about ethics, legacy, and duty." She nodded once, stiff. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Be careful what ghosts you resurrect, Melanie. They tend to walk in straight lines." They called it an internal review board. I called it a setup. I was officially appointed to lead the internal investigation regarding the candlestick leak. The appointment came in an official envelope sealed and signed by the Office of Military Justice. I should have felt honored. Instead, I felt cornered. The panel was a triangle I never wanted to redraw. Charles Reyes, my father, retired logistics commander. Lucia Reyes, my mother, senior analyst for defense ethics. And Melanie, still glowing from the ceremony, now listed as liaison to legal administration. Each of them had something to lose. Each of them had something to protect. None of them wanted me there. Our first meeting took place in a briefing room at Fort Bragg. The walls were lined with old campaign banners, citations for valor, and grainy photographs of men and women who had disappeared into footnotes. I walked in first. No one stood to greet me. My mother adjusted her glasses but said nothing. My father nodded but wouldn't meet my eyes. Melanie smiled with that same rehearsed curve of lips, the one that never reached her eyes. "Let's begin," I said. I projected the initial breach data on the screen. The room dimmed. My voice didn't. "This is the file in question. Time-stamped, traced, authenticated. The breach originated from a personal admin device linked to this board. I didn't need to say whose. The silence did it for me." Lucia finally spoke. "This could have been automated. A background sync. Syncs don't create macros, I said. And they don't resurrect classified records. My father crossed his arms. You're suggesting deliberate intent. I'm suggesting we don't pretend ignorance. Not here. Melanie flipped a page in her notebook. What exactly is your goal, Carmen? It was the first time she'd said my name since I returned. The syllables felt dry in her mouth like she'd practiced but never rehearsed feeling it. My goal, I said slowly, is not revenge. It's accountability. And the truth. Wherever it leads. Charles shifted uncomfortably. You're leading this board, not prosecuting it. Then help me do that, sir. Calling him sir was more instinct than respect. He didn't flinch, but his eyes tightened at the corners. I distributed hard copies of the digital trace, marked with metadata and signature logs. Melanie didn't reach for hers. Neither did my mother. Only Charles did. The briefing ended in controlled silence. No raised voices. No accusations. But when we left the room, no one walked beside me. Outside, the wind had picked up. Somewhere on base, a training alarm echoed in the distance. Short, sharp, clinical. I paused by the window, looking out across the parade field. It hadn't changed, but I had. Back then, I marched that field in full uniform, believing my family would always stand behind me. Now I was leading an inquiry that would cut through bloodlines and ranks. They had put me in charge because they thought I would protect them. They were wrong. I wasn't there to avenge my death on paper. I was there to expose the living. Lucia handed me a sealed folder late that evening. No words, just her eyes searching mine for a reaction. I recognized the seal before I even opened it. Red stripe, internal use. Only marked in the old classification system from before the 2010 encryption overhaul. I sat down at the old kitchen table, the one we used to eat pancakes on Sunday mornings. Now it was covered in shadows and memory. The folder creaked open like a reluctant confession. Inside, field reports, casualty summaries, and a single photo of me, taken days before Operation Candlestick. There were annotations in the margins. In her handwriting, she had read this. 15 years ago. There was no shock on her face, no confusion, only silence. I flipped through the pages. One document referenced a strategic fallback executed by Captain C. Reyes. Another referenced a classified casualty. Me. You had this the whole time, I asked. Lucia didn't answer. She just looked down at her tea. I pushed the folder toward her. Why didn't you ask me? Her fingers trembled slightly. Because I didn't want to know. I stared at her. Not in anger, in disbelief. I read the casualty report, she said, voice barely above a whisper. I told myself it was a bureaucratic error. That they filed it wrong. You told yourself I was dead. She finally looked at me. No. I told myself they killed the version of you I couldn't save. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then she added almost mechanically. The system logs didn't match the narrative. Your discharge paperwork came 6 months after you're declared KIA. I suspected something, but you didn't ask. I didn't want to choose between my daughter and my clearance. That landed. For someone like Lucia, faithful to structure, loyal to process, it wasn't cowardice, it was doctrine. I stood up, taking the folder with me. Whatever you chose back then, you're going to have to choose again, I said. She didn't stop me, didn't call out. I walked down the hallway toward my old room, feeling every inch of the house that had held so many answers, none of which were spoken aloud. That night, I scanned the documents into a secure archive, created a new file, logged her annotations, not as evidence, but as context. She hadn't betrayed me, but she hadn't protected me either. Somewhere between omission and obedience, she'd chosen silence, and now I couldn't afford it. 6.3. The suspect, 652. His name appeared like a scar I thought had faded. Brent Holloway. He wasn't just a name in an old report. He was the one who used to snarl at me during mission debriefs, the man who called me a liability for refusing to greenlight an airstrike over Mosul in 2014. We'd clashed over ethics, and ethics don't win wars, or so he'd said. That night in the makeshift war room we'd converted from my father's den, I saw the pattern form. The malware that triggered the classified breach. It wasn't new. It was ghost code, originally deployed during Operation Mosul, buried deep inside a contingency system. Dormant. Until Melanie opened the wrong archive. I leaned closer to the screen. The metadata lined up. Initial embed, February 2014. Operation ID, Moss Canned Alpha. System Origin Field Com Node. Operator B. Holloway. There it was. Like a landmine forgotten in the soil. Charles walked in with coffee, glanced at the screen, then froze. You think it's Brent? I don't think I replied. I know. His jaw clenched. Brent had served under him once. That loyalty would cost him objectivity. But Melanie triggered it, Charles said. She accessed a dormant folder linked to Candlestick. She wouldn't know the code was embedded. But Brent. He knew exactly where he left it. Charles took a slow sip, then sat down. Do you want me to question him? No. I want him to feel the shift. The moment he realizes I'm not a ghost anymore. Later that day during our joint review session, I asked for Brent to appear via secure call. He answered with his usual grin, the one that never reached his eyes. General Reyes, he said. Back from the dead, I see. I didn't smile. Funny thing about the dead. We don't forget. I pulled up a still frame, his user credentials, accessing the 2014 server. His face dropped for half a second. Then it hardened. That data was decommissioned. It was dormant, like a trap. You planted it. And now Melanie set it off. His voice turned flat. You going to court-martial your own sister? I didn't blink. I'm not court-martialing her. I'm clearing her. But you, Brent, you're going to answer for what you buried. He laughed, but it didn't last. You're bluffing. I tapped the table. Am I? The feed went dead. He'd logged off. Charles muttered, You're really not bluffing, are you? No. And now he knows that too. Melanie hadn't betrayed the system. She'd stepped into a minefield Brent had left behind. But me, I knew how to map landmines. And I was just getting started. The courtroom smelled of metal and old carpet, and the hum of quiet anticipation buzzed in the air. I adjusted my jacket, one that hadn't seen daylight in over a decade, and stepped up to the microphone. The brass nameplate read General Carmen Reyes. Some stared, others whispered. Melanie sat across the room, flanked by two advisors, her posture perfect, but her eyes clouded. I am not here today to assign guilt. I began, letting the words settle. I'm here to reveal a pattern of negligence, masked as protocol. A few pens stopped scribbling. One camera tilted closer. The panel of military judges watched me like they didn't expect me to finish a full sentence. Like I'd vanish again. I didn't. The breach that endangered Operation Candlestick did not stem from betrayal, I said. It stemmed from a systemic flaw, a culture that overlooks its own vulnerability because it's easier to blame the individual than examine the machine. I glanced at Melanie. Her face didn't move, but her fingers twitched on her lap. A tiny motion, fear maybe, or something deeper, recognition. I continued presenting logs, timelines, metadata trails. The file was accessed from a deprecated system. The malware embedded came from 2014, dormant, until accessed by someone with no knowledge of its presence. A judge raised a brow. And who accessed it? My sister, I answered calmly. Not with malice, with routine clearance and the wrong timestamp. The room tensed. Melanie closed her eyes for half a second, a private surrender no one else caught. I inhaled. I served for 15 years in active operations. I know what sabotage looks like. This was not sabotage. This was poor system hygiene. A failure of our infrastructure, not our people. I paused. The silence wrapped around me. I request that my sister be cleared of all formal suspicion, and that the focus of this investigation be redirected toward legacy system vulnerabilities and outdated archive protocols. General Farley, sitting in the back, nodded subtly. One of the judges scribbled a note. When I stepped down, I didn't look at Melanie. I didn't need to. That wasn't why I was there. I wasn't there to hurt her. I was there to change the way the system handles ghosts. And maybe, just maybe, to remind them that sometimes the ghost can still speak. That evening after the hearing, Melanie submitted a voluntary statement to the Office of Military Justice. I received a digital copy within the hour labeled Personal Confession, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Reyes. The document was stark. No legal jargon, no preamble. Just a line across the top in bold, I did not intend to cause a breach. I erased a name out of envy, not malice. My name. I sat on the edge of the cot in the base housing, holding the tablet as if it were ticking. Every word she'd written was like a cold drop of rain, and somewhere halfway down the page, I felt something crack open inside me. Not anger, not even betrayal. Just silence, vast and old. I saw the way they looked at her. Melanie had typed. Even when she said nothing, she was remembered. I thought if I erased her, she would disappear, but the silence only grew louder. A confession, not to the court but to the truth. And in a way, maybe to me. She admitted accessing the system alone late at night. She admitted using my old credentials still embedded in a shared archive, not knowing the hidden code buried beneath would detonate a decade of buried intel. She confessed to deleting a field in my personnel file. Status deceased. Just to see if anyone would notice, they did. Melanie had always been careful, competent, even admired. But her brilliance was built beside mine, and where I chose the shadows, she chose the spotlight. I think she always wondered why I didn't compete. She never realized I wasn't trying to win. I was trying to survive. At the bottom of the statement, she signed her name, then added a single line in blue ink scanned in beneath. I was jealous of how quiet she could be, and still be unforgettable. My throat tightened. I had fought wars across oceans, but never expected the sharpest wound would come from home. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Her confession was a line drawn in blue, not to hurt but maybe to heal. And sometimes the only justice left is being seen for who you really were, long after they wrote you off the page. The morning after Melanie's confession, the air on base felt changed. Less metallic, less rehearsed. Whispers passed through corridors, but no one dared to name what they were feeling. Then, at a press event held by the Office of Military Justice, my father, Colonel Charles Reyes, stepped up to the podium. Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned in, and for once he didn't clear his throat. He didn't shuffle his notes. He simply looked out across the crowd and said I didn't ask. Because I thought I knew. I'm sorry. 7 words. But they cracked something that had stood for decades. There was a long pause after. Someone coughed. A mic squeaked. Then he stepped down and walked past me without stopping. He didn't look back. In the silence that followed, I remembered being 17 sitting on the front porch after I'd announced I was enlisting. He hadn't spoken a word then either. Just stood at the door, arms crossed, until I gave up waiting for approval and left. That same silence had followed me for 18 years. But this one, this silence, felt different. Not empty. Just new. Back at the base, Lucia waited for me near the officers' quarters. She handed me a flask of black coffee like it was peace offering. He wrote those words himself, she said. No speechwriter, no coaching. Just sat at the kitchen table this morning and wrote. I nodded, not ready to speak. My throat still held the echo of his voice. Later, I found the video of the press event posted online. The comments were brutal. Military forums dissecting our family like a failed experiment. But tucked between them was a message from someone I hadn't seen in years, Sergeant Amina Hale. General Reyes, she wrote, we never forgot you. Thank you for showing up when silence was louder than any order. That night I walked the edge of the airstrip alone, boots crunching over gravel. The stars above didn't blink. I thought about how fragile memory was, how easy it had been for one line in a system to erase a decade. But somehow, in 7 words, my father had given me back something I thought was gone forever. The acknowledgement that I existed, that I mattered. Even if too late. Maybe that's where change begins. Not in victory, not even in vindication. But in one person finally saying, I see you, and meaning it. We gathered around the dining table in the old house on Ridgeview Drive. Me, my parents, and Melanie. The same table where I had once celebrated my 12th birthday, where war stories used to flow more freely than compassion. Now it was covered in a simple white cloth. No centerpiece, just the weight of time. I had invited them not to confront, but to share. I poured water into each glass with the kind of precision I had learned over years of rationing in desert outposts. Then I sat down, across from my mother, beside my father, diagonal from Melanie. They waited. I placed a small black notebook on the table, its edges worn corners softened by age. I opened to a page bookmarked with an old photograph of me in uniform, and I began. Iran, 2008. The mission was listed as surveillance. It became something else within 72 hours. Lucia flinched. Charles didn't move. Melanie blinked once. We lost 2 of our own on day 3. Evac was delayed due to sandstorm interference. Communications were down. and for 76 hours I didn't know if anyone knew we were alive. My voice didn't shake. It simply filled the room. I made choices I wasn't proud of, not unethical, but hard. I signed off on calling in an extraction that left behind wounded allies because we had a narrow window and limited air cover. I documented everything. I filed a report. But by the time it reached the chain of command, it had been stripped, redacted, and buried. Silence. I didn't disappear because I was ashamed. I disappeared because the version of me that returned wasn't welcomed. I became a liability, someone who knew too much and said too little. Lucia reached for a napkin. Melanie stared at the table. I tapped the notebook. This has every classified detail that was omitted. This is the record of the silence I chose, not out of cowardice, but out of necessity. Charles finally spoke. Why now? I looked at him. Because I want you to know me, not the name that vanished in 2009. Not the shadow Melanie erased in a line of code. Me, Carmen Reyes. A woman who gave everything, including her place in this family. My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. Melanie said nothing. But for the first time in 18 years, no one left the table. That night, I didn't sleep in the guest room. I slept in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by faded posters and the steady hum of an old ceiling fan. And for the first time in years, I dreamt without waking up in a sweat. Because the silence wasn't just mine anymore. It had been passed across that table, like a story finally told. The next morning, Melanie arrived with a cake box in her hands. It was modest, blue frosting with white piping, the kind you'd find at a small-town bakery, not a boutique patisserie. She placed it in the center of the table without ceremony. None of us said anything for a few seconds. Then she opened the lid. Written on top in simple block letters, General, Sister, Witness. No candles, no dates. Just those 3 words. I looked at her. She didn't look away. I didn't know how else to say it, she said. But I figured maybe this could be a start. I nodded slowly. You chose blue. Melanie shrugged. Your old favorite. Before it became your uniform. We all sat down again. No toast, no awkward speeches, just forks meeting ceramic. The silence was different now, not cold, but cautious. As if words might ruin what clarity had finally begun to surface. Charles took a bite first, then Lucia. I followed. Melanie waited last, watching us all with the quiet posture of someone trying not to intrude into her own family. It wasn't about forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe never. But there was something in the way she handed me a slice, with extra frosting. The corner piece, the one she used to steal when we were kids. A silent recognition of a shared memory neither of us had spoken about in decades. Lucia finally broke the quiet. I remember when you used to bake together. Carmen would crack the eggs wrong, and Melanie would scream like the whole operation was compromised. Melanie smiled. I was 10. Everything was life or death. I allowed myself to laugh, a short one, more breath than sound. But real. The photo wall still hadn't changed. My name was still absent from family emails. And my childhood bedroom still had a broken drawer that jammed when pulled. But this cake, this small, humble gesture, felt like the beginning of something I couldn't define yet. Not healing, not reconciliation, but presence. She had called me a general. She had called me her sister. She had called me a witness. All things I had once been alone. Now at least she saw them too. As we cleared the plates, Melanie turned to me. I know I can't undo the past, she said. But if you're willing, I'd like to be a part of whatever comes next. I didn't answer. Instead, I folded the cake box lid closed and tucked it under my arm. That depends, I said. Can you bake next year's? She laughed. It was shaky, uncertain. But this time, she didn't look away. The lecture hall at Fort Bragg was colder than I remembered. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above me as cadets filed into their seats, notebooks in hand, eyes bright with the untested confidence of youth. I stood at the podium in uniform, but not as a symbol. Just as someone who had come back. It was the final session of the semester, military ethics and the legacy of operational command. Most of the cadets hadn't known who I was until General Farley introduced me at the beginning of the course. Even now, they referred to me more often as ma'am than General Reyes. I didn't correct them. I walked them through the structure of decision trees, under fire. Rules of engagement. the limitations of moral clarity in asymmetric warfare. They listened well, took notes. Some asked questions about protocol, others about precedent. But at the end, one cadet near the back, quiet all term, raised his hand. He stood to speak. "Ma'am, what would you say is the hardest part of war?" The room fell silent. Pens stilled. Chairs stopped creaking. I looked at him. I remembered his name, Cadet Winslow. His father had served in Iraq, killed in a convoy ambush in 2005. I could have said many things: the loss, the lies, the distance between what we were told and what we witnessed. But I took a breath and told the truth I had earned. "Surviving," I said, "without becoming someone who wounds others just to prove you still feel." He blinked, then nodded. I could feel the weight of that answer settle over the room. It was the kind of silence you can't plan for, the kind that carries history. Another cadet murmured, "How do you stop yourself from becoming that?" I smiled, but not out of amusement. You learn the difference between silence and suppression, between standing down and walking away. You learn to sit with your pain long enough that it doesn't become someone else's. The bell didn't ring to end the class, but slowly cadets began to rise. Some lingered. A few approached the front to thank me. One handed me a folded note. I didn't open it until later. It read, "Thank you for reminding me that surviving isn't weakness." As I packed up, I noticed the reflection of myself in the darkened monitor across the room. The same face I had seen in the bathroom mirror months ago, but steadier now, not healed, not whole, but human. On my way out, I passed the memorial wall in the hallway. Names etched into brass, some familiar, some forgotten by most. I paused at one panel, a name that used to be mine, listed under KIA. I took out a pen, not to correct it but to underline it. Not a ghost, not a shame. Just a reminder that I had been erased once, but not anymore. They invited me back to Washington under the guise of a guest lecturer, but I knew it was more. There had been a quiet shift in the command's tone ever since the inquiry closed. No formal apologies, no press releases. But now they were making space for my name again. The memorial was held at the National Archives under the rotunda, where the Constitution and the Bill of Rights rested. It wasn't a ceremony for soldiers who died in battle. It was for those who'd been removed, misclassified, redacted, or silenced by clerical decision or political discomfort. I wore my full uniform, every pin, every bar. My presence was not a request. A junior officer ushered me toward the center aisle. He looked maybe 23, barely out of ROTC. He kept glancing at my chest, my nameplate, my ribbons, the silver star above my heart. Then he said quietly, "Ma'am, your record helped us fix the database." I nodded. "It's not about the record," I said. "It's about the silence it left behind." The event began. A historian gave a speech on operational memory and institutional erasure. A few families clutched folded flags, photos of loved ones once marked non-combat related. I stood and waited for the moment. Then the screen lit up. Names appeared, dozens, then hundreds. Each one restored to the system, acknowledged not with rank or commendation, but as truth finally written. And there it was, General Carmen Reyes, service record reinstated. No applause, no camera flashes. Just a long, steady silence. I didn't cry. Instead, I walked up to the digital panel. My fingers hovered over the display. The last time I'd seen my name in a military database, it had a black bar through it. Now the bar was gone. And in its place, a date of commission, a list of campaigns, and the words "status active retired." I touched the glass lightly. They erased me once, I said under my breath. But history has a longer memory than power. On my way out, I passed an older couple reading the screen. The woman turned to me. "Were you one of them?" "I still am," I said. "But now I'm seen." Outside, the flag above the archives flapped in a quiet wind. I walked down the steps, not toward anything, but away from erasure, toward breath, toward space, toward the version of myself I had fought to make real again. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't closure. It was presence. And this time I wasn't alone. I stayed behind after the rotunda emptied. The quiet felt earned. Not sacred, not victorious, just steady. There's a kind of silence that follows truth, and it doesn't echo. It lands. A few days later, I returned to Fort Bragg to complete the lecture series. They'd asked for my insights on operational integrity, but I ended up speaking about resilience, not in the motivational sense, but in the way metal bends without breaking, in the way people carry damage with dignity. One cadet stayed behind after the last lecture. Same one who asked me about war. He handed me a folded note. "You made me reconsider what strength looks like," he said. Then he left. The note was blank, on purpose. His way of saying he was still searching. I kept it. That weekend I visited the training grounds. Same place I once ran drills in boots too tight, barking orders at recruits half my age. It looked smaller now, or maybe I had become larger from the weight I'd learned to hold without collapsing. I stood alone at the edge of the field watching the next class file past. Uniforms neat, faces alert. One of them turned to glance at me, not out of curiosity but recognition. A quiet nod, like they knew who I was, not just what I had done. I didn't return home immediately. I stayed in Lexington for a few weeks, helped Melanie box up some things, sat with my mother in the kitchen while she boiled tea she no longer drank. She apologized again, not with words, but by listening longer than she used to. My father mowed the lawn in silence, but every morning the newspaper was folded and waiting for me at the table. Small gestures, but real. Before I left, I stood in the hallway beside the photo wall. A new frame had been added. It wasn't large, just enough space for one picture. It was me, in uniform, at the archive, touching the screen. The caption read, "General Reyes, fortitude found. Not forgiven, not forgotten, just placed." I walked out of the house and closed the door behind me. This time it didn't feel like leaving. It felt like turning a page, one I finally got to write. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what survives when you return. And I had returned, as myself. People sometimes ask if I regret the silence, if I regret not fighting harder to be heard earlier, if I regret not correcting the record the moment they wrote me off, deleted me from the files, from the stories. But silence isn't absence, and absence isn't defeat. Sometimes silence is what lets you hear your own voice again, clearer without the noise of needing to prove yourself to anyone. I didn't come back for revenge. I came back for truth. And in finding it, I didn't just reclaim a title or correct a name. I reclaimed the right to exist, fully, visibly, and without permission. If you're listening to this and you've been erased, doubted, or made to feel small, remember this. You don't have to roar to be undeniable. You don't have to be perfect to be whole. And you don't need anyone else to name your worth. They called me the ghost once, but I'm still here. And now I speak.